In 1807, the Treaties of Tilsit were signed and Napoleon's empire was left ascendant. Prussia had been smashed, Austria cowed, and Russia was now an ally. From Madrid to the Niemen, France and her satellites dominated the European continent. Only Britain and a few remaining outposts guarded by the Royal Navy continued to defy Paris. For the moment, this state of affairs seemed bound to continue. Tsar Alexander appeared genuinely committed to his new entente with Napoleon. Prussia and Austria would have to accommodate themselves with French hegemony as best they could, and Britain had little likelihood of destroying the coalition Paris had brought to bear against her. Two events changed this over the following 2 years. Firstly, Spain would rise up in popular revolt against Napoleonic subjugation, and Austria, fearing the same fate, would wage one last great war for dynastic independence. The balance of Europe did not fundamentally alter in this brief period, but these were the years when the seeds for the rest of the century were sown. Almost all diplomatic measures undertaken by Napoleon in the aftermath of Tilsit were in some way connected with his ultimate aim of bringing Britain to her knees. Denmark and Russia would first be brought into the anti-British coalition, followed by Prussia and Austria. Even with the French fleet sunk at Trafalgar 2 years earlier, another invasion attempt wasn't ruled out. March 1808 saw Napoleon planning to concentrate flotillas in Dutch ports, rather than Boulogne or Calais. Well into the latter years of his reign, the Emperor would still be spending, and extracting from vassals, exorbitant sums to build a fleet that could once again be sunk by the Royal Navy. Proposals to invade Sicily, the Russo-Swedish War of 1808, and Napoleon's campaign to crush Portugal and subjugate Spain were all at least ostensibly designed to bring Britain down. Unable to renew the naval struggle immediately, France also turned to economic warfare. The Berlin Decrees of 1806, followed by the Milan and Fontainebleau Decrees in 1807 and 1810 respectively, imposed a continent-wide blockade of British goods. In January 1807, Britain retaliated with its own orders in council, but for a country who had just lost 1/3 of her export market, the situation seemed desperate. More than any other year, including 1940, Britain was alone in 1807, with its very existence on the line. Her survival until the turning point of 1812 was not pretty or heroic. The final result would be a triumph like no other, but in 1807 the future appeared bleak. The geriatric Prime Minister, Portland, did not inspire much optimism. An experienced statesman, but now 69 going on 90 years old, ill, lethargic and incapable of acting decisively, he allowed his younger and more talented ministers to dominate policy, a strategy that was bound to lead to a clash between such ambitious men. For now, Portland offered prestige to a government badly in need of it, but he hardly inspired great confidence. The ministers of actual importance to the government were Canning, Castlereagh, Hawkesbury and Perceval. From 1807, a combination of some or all of these men would set British policy from Whitehall, helped by an extremely small civil service working themselves into an early grave. With France finally undistracted by continental foes, the British war effort, which was strung out across the globe, had to become more streamlined, but it was hard to see which commitments could be cut back on. Egypt was evacuated and relations with the Sicilian government were tense to the point London even contemplated abandoning what it considered to be a hopelessly corrupt state, but ultimately decided its strategic and symbolic importance was too great. The Secretary for War, Castlereagh, hoped to stage an assault into Naples with Sicilian troops, a doomed idea rightly scotched by George III. Since there was little immediate way for Britain to attack France, the most pressing task after Tilsit became simply to save whatever it could from Europe. This led to perhaps the most controversial British action of the whole war, the bombardment of Copenhagen. A supposedly secret clause from Tilsit agreed that the sizable Danish fleet was to be commandeered by the French. How much the British knew about Napoleon's upcoming ultimatum to Denmark is still debated, but the Foreign Secretary, Canning, was not prepared to leave the fate of the Danish navy to chance. Passionate, energetic and impetuous, Canning was the most brilliant orator of his day, with supreme self-confidence that was paired with a grasp of foreign affairs unsurpassed at Whitehall until the days of Salisbury. These crucial few years would be the making of Canning, but as for this first tenure as Foreign Secretary, it was not his most brilliant. An ultimatum of his own was dispatched to Denmark, albeit delivered with far less tact than intended. demanding the Danes surrender their fleet to Britain for the course of the war. When this was refused, Copenhagen was bombarded, 2,000 civilians were killed, 18 ships of the line were captured, and the first modern translation of Beowulf was burned. Denmark soon after entered into Napoleon's coalition, but her power had been permanently neutered. The expedition had also served a dual purpose in regards to Russia. Before the full details of Tilsit were known, Canning still hoped to salvage the alliance with St. Petersburg, but in the face of mounting evidence a pact had been concluded between the Tsar and Napoleon, Britain now faced the prospect of war with the entire continent. Canning thus thought that by opening the Baltic and bringing the Royal Navy into the area, Britain would demonstrate its ability to maintain the struggle, threaten the Russian fortress of Kronstadt, and strengthen anti-Tilsit elements in St. Petersburg. It was, to put it delicately, one of Canning's less genius schemes. Alexander, who thought of himself as a protector of small nations, was furious with the action at Copenhagen, and any threat to Kronstadt was outweighed tenfold by the French armies currently stationed in Poland. The subsequent break with Russia and declaration of war would have happened anyway, but Canning hardly won Britain any favours, though the attack did at least deter Russia from any serious naval action in the Baltic. At the end of the year then, George III's ministers had secured naval supremacy once more for the foreseeable future, but the French Empire remained ascendant on the continent, safe in its new alliance with Russia, which Britain had little hope of breaking. As in 1940, maintaining the struggle until time and the enemy himself came to London's rescue seemed to be the only option. As the ambassador to Vienna remarked, these fresh successes will probably lead to fresh pretensions on the part of France, and persuade Napoleon, to whom no project seems preposterous or impossible, to adopt that of carrying his army into the heart of Russia and attempt to dictate the law even at St. Petersburg. In July 1807, Alexander I, Emperor of all Russia, and Bonaparte, as he was then known in Petersburg, met on a raft in the River Niemen. "I hate the English as much as you do," were Alexander's first words according to one account. "Then we have made peace," replied Napoleon. It is untrue that France and Russia were never real partners, or that the alliance was ruined by war with Britain. They were genuine collaborators against London. It was Europe that their eventual union was to break down over. For sure many, perhaps most of the leading figures in St. Petersburg were unhappy with the French alliance. Merchants were annoyed at the breach with Britain, as were Anglophile figures at the court like General Bennigsen. Much of the imperial family despised Napoleon as an upstart. The new French ambassador, Caulaincourt, found the doors of high society closed to him. But the Entente also had its supporters. These consisted of the likes of Admiral Chichagov and even Alexander's own brother Constantine, who tended to either admire Napoleon or despise Britain. The foreign minister, Rumyantsev, thought an alliance would allow Russia to make gains elsewhere with French support. The more tentative supporters, of which Alexander himself could probably have been counted, were the likes of Mikhail Speransky, the dominant figure in the Russian government. Focused on internal reform, Speransky put forward the most rational argument for the alliance. That, though it was doomed to fail, it bought Russia time after the great disasters of Austerlitz and Friedland to recover and reorganise. The strongest voices against Tilsit came from Russian nationalism. This view bridled at the perceived humiliation and the idea that there could ever be lasting peace with Napoleon. Yet even strong Francophobes, such as, ironically, or perhaps not, the new ambassador to Paris, Tolstoy, announced he would gladly support the alliance if France evacuated Prussia and Poland, so that the countries nowhere touched, though this was hardly a ringing endorsement for any relationship. At the centre of these conflicting viewpoints was Alexander, 29 years old at the time of Tilsit and a mass of contradictions. His private correspondence as early as July 1807 shows the Tsar was never under Napoleon's spell like the French Emperor initially believed. He did, however, undoubtedly feel some personal attachment, and in the aftermath of the meeting, Russia took real steps to wage war with Britain. Sweden was forced to break with London. There was an attempt to organise a defence of the Baltic with Denmark, and British trade was destroyed in Russia. Alexander also anticipated significant benefits from the alliance, particularly the revival of St. Petersburg's preeminent position in Constantinople. In under a year, these hopes had been destroyed. Alexander's fairly modest expectations in return for Russia making peace, changing her system and breaking with Britain were ignored by Napoleon. During the treaty, he had been more than forthcoming with promises and hints of future Russian gains, but after pocketing the concessions to France, Napoleon declared that from that point forward the alliance must proceed on the basis of equality. Put another way, France must be compensated for any Russian gains. The principle was disturbing enough, the way France applied it even worse. Russia had taken the Danubian principalities in its ongoing war with the Ottomans. At Tilsit, Napoleon had been full of hints that Russia would be supported in any annexation of the territory. Yet when the time came, the French declared that they must be compensated for such an action with Prussian Silesia, an outrageous claim which left Alexander feeling lied to. When Napoleon invaded Portugal, he announced it was actually a sacrifice for the alliance, and that Russia must follow suit by invading Finland, whilst promises of a potential partition of the Ottoman Empire were quickly scotched by Paris. Russia had committed to bringing Sweden into the continental system at Tilsit, and been given a blank cheque to seize Finland. Napoleon suggested to the point of demanding that Russia force the issue via invasion. Historians such as Paul Schroeder suggested this was not really Alexander's aim. He intended to force a break with Britain, but did not wish for a war over Finland, which could be better exploited under current conditions anyway. In the end, it was the Swedish King Gustavus's intransigence, even in the face of British suggestions to make peace, that forced Alexander's hand with invasion in 1808. Despite the Russo-French alliance rapidly fragmenting over these issues, a British move in February 1808 potentially offered Napoleon the chance to cement the relationship. Canning, through the Russian ambassador, suggested a peace with France on the basis of uti possidetis. Napoleon apparently reacted to this agreeably, telling the Russian ambassador he would even be willing to relinquish Hanover and Portugal for such a peace. What did Canning actually intend with this offer? Some have suggested it was merely a ploy to intimidate St. Petersburg. For 6 months, Alexander had assumed he could buy Russia time at Britain's expense. Canning was in effect turning this on its head and threatening to push Napoleon's energies back eastwards, in the hope of panicking Alexander into realigning with Britain. But the Foreign Secretary's private letters show he did genuinely consider a possible peace. It could, of course, only be a truce à la Amiens, but he does seem to have considered it as a serious possibility. Canning's offer, however, is more interesting for how Napoleon used it against Russia. Canning might not have been totally bluffing with the proposal, but the French Emperor certainly was when he indicated his willingness to accept it to the Russians. Instead, Napoleon thought it showed Britain was nearly finished, intensifying his recruitment drives in Germany and combing his naval allies for yet more ships. It was then suggested that Russia, already at war with Britain, take a more active role with an expedition down the Euphrates towards India. As Schroeder notes, Napoleon's ploy was transparent enough. He was telling Russia that either she had to take a more active part in the war, or France would make peace with Britain and focus on the continent. The Russians did not actually dismiss these suggestions out of hand and were tempted by additional hints of a potential Ottoman partition, which Napoleon was again talking about. But again, it became apparent there was no substance behind these promises, and a succession of absurd arguments from the foreign minister, Champagny, made it clear Napoleon was incapable of any fair bargain. Nothing restored Franco-Russian relations over the coming months. Tolstoy was not exactly a smash hit at the French court, almost ending up in a duel with Marshal Ney after declaring the French had won in the East because of luck. He bombarded the Russian government with a constant stream of reports advocating military preparedness, peace with Britain and a defensive understanding with Austria. This, combined with Napoleon's unsurprising complaints, saw him replaced with Kurakin, who was soon making the same arguments. Yet nothing indicates Alexander seriously considered acting on these suggestions, even when the war in Iberia began. The shine had, however, very clearly gone off the whole relationship, perhaps best displayed at the Congress of Erfurt, the second and last meeting between the two emperors. Napoleon came seeking a free hand in Spain and to reaffirm the alliance, both against Britain and in case of war with Austria. Alexander was in a far stronger position than a year earlier. Russia had long since recovered from Friedland, and French armies no longer menaced her border, but were instead stuck in the rapidly deteriorating Spanish situation. Yet, at least theoretically, Alexander agreed to all of Napoleon's demands. He set out his reasoning in a long letter to his mother, a staunch critic of the French alliance. Despite the setbacks in Spain, the French Empire remained formidable, capable of matching any force that, say, an Austro-Russian partnership could field. For now, alliance with Napoleon bought security, but in the cooling of relations with France, Alexander was encouraged by Talleyrand, Napoleon's former foreign minister, out of office and out of favour, yet bizarrely brought along by the emperor, and entrusted with private plans such as his intention to marry a Russian princess, which Michael Brose compares to entering a confessional with a gossip columnist. Asked to smooth over relations, Talleyrand instead spent most of the conference encouraging Alexander to resist Napoleon, advice the Tsar only partially accepted. Russia remained committed to France at Erfurt, but the relationship was souring. Bonaparte thinks I'm nothing but an idiot. They who laugh longest, laugh last, Alexander wrote to the King of Prussia. But it was Napoleon himself who perhaps encapsulated best why the Congress failed to cement his alliance, scoffing after it that Alexander was defiant and unspeakably obstinate. He wanted to treat with me as between equals. Erfurt was far from the most important event of 1808. That title was earned in the unlikely country of Spain. Joined by alliance with France since the early days of the consulate, the kingdom had basically been ignored, its court generally used as a place for Napoleon to deposit troublesome or semi-disgraced diplomats. Like many of his interventions, the emperor's interest grew out of dissatisfaction with the performance of an ally. The country was effectively ruled by the royal family's favourite, Manuel Godoy, whilst the king and crown prince squabbled in the background. Good-looking, wily, ostentatious and corrupt, Godoy was despised by much of the population and Prince Ferdinand, but his hold over the king and queen was fairly incredible. When he intercepted a letter from Napoleon to Charles, warning him of Godoy's affair with the queen, he merely passed it on. Despite the unpopularity of the war with Britain in the country at large, Godoy had initially embraced it enthusiastically, building up the navy and hoping to make vast gains, including Gibraltar, Jamaica and Portugal. But Napoleon had insisted on making the Spanish fleet part of his plans for an invasion of Britain, and its subsequent destruction at Trafalgar had shook the court's belief in the war and French alliance. Even so, Godoy extracted a commitment from Napoleon in 1806 for the partition of Portugal, with a principality for himself to be carved out. When Napoleon once again ignored a British rescue mission to Portugal in August and instead launched his own war against Prussia, Godoy blew up, mobilising the Spanish army on the same day as the Battle of Vienna. He beat a hasty retreat when Prussia was smashed, but to punish this insubordination, Napoleon forced Spain into the continental system and recruited 15,000 of its best soldiers to serve in northern Germany. These were taken from the Kingdom of Etruria, a Spanish satellite that France was now free to annex. Nonetheless, the logic of the continental system, requiring every port in Europe to be closed to Britain, meant Godoy still held out hope for the conquest of Portugal, a British ally. Napoleon demanded Portugal cease to be a conduit for British goods, and after delay invaded in October 1807. The Treaty of Fontainebleau, signed on the 27th of that month, agreed to the partition of the country with Spain, the King of Etruria to be compensated with the north, Lisbon left for later discussions, and the south to Godoy. Portugal was the first state to befall the ruthless aggrandisement of the French Empire, driven by the needs of the blockade. In reality, the partition scheme had always been a blind to introduce General Junot's troops into Spain. With French soldiers occupying strategic positions in the north, Napoleon would be free to impose his will. On the 30th of November, Junot seized Lisbon, barely missing the royal family, who fled to Brazil on British ships and consequently opened the Portuguese Empire up to British goods. In Portugal, the usual contributions were forced from the country, whilst the French took over administration of the kingdom, which was disturbing to Spain. But more sinister were French actions in the rest of the peninsula. Junot had been ordered to map Spanish territory as his army moved down to Portugal, whilst 118,000 French troops were brought in to occupy strongpoints in the peninsula. By March 1808, Napoleon had decided for certain that Spain must be brought into the French Empire, though the details he hadn't yet worked out. His initial battery of threatening demands make it seem as if at this point he only thought of annexing the north of the country up to the Ebro, and sufficing with only dominating the government of Charles. Yet soon after this he was planning to lead 50,000 men against Madrid himself, and offer the Spanish crown to his brother Louis, then King of Holland. In Schroeder's words, the only thing more remarkable than Napoleon's ability to grasp immediate opportunities and exploit them was his ability to ignore deeper problems and deceive himself in doing so. For example, he seems to have genuinely believed Spain was a country rich in potential loot, and that her colonial empire would simply fall into his hands once he took Madrid. Napoleon cannot alone be blamed for these misconceptions. The Spanish adventure had been encouraged in the first place by Talleyrand, who thought France's domination of the kingdom natural, but was in reality as ignorant of the country as his emperor. Thus, Napoleon set the course for a war that was to ultimately lead to his empire's destruction. Plenty of theories abound for why he undertook the action, when the indirect control he already had over Spain could easily have been maintained. The simplest is that his name was Napoleon. At first, however, the emperor's gamble seemed once again to have paid off. The initial Spanish reaction was against Godoy and Charles, who were deemed to have allowed the humiliation. In mid-March, the mutiny of Aranjuez arrested Godoy and deposed Charles in favour of Ferdinand. Ferdinand was convinced to travel north under French escort to the town of Bayonne, where they were joined by Charles, who once again claimed the Spanish throne. Napoleon was not impressed by the Bourbons. He simply described Ferdinand as very ugly and Maria Louisa as shriveled like a mummy. The family reunion saw Charles immediately try to bludgeon Ferdinand with his cane, whilst the Queen egged both men on with obscenities. The farce that occurred here is well known. Napoleon forced Ferdinand to abdicate in favour of Charles, who was in turn made to abdicate in favour of Napoleon himself. Louis, previously earmarked for the crown, had denied the offer, knowing his Dutch subjects, to whom he had grown attached, would be immediately annexed into France. Instead, Napoleon offered the crown to his older brother Joseph. As King of Naples, he proved a generally humane and competent, if not particularly well-liked, ruler, but holding the Spanish throne was a challenge even legitimate monarchs struggled with. For a middling Corsican lawyer like Joseph, it was always going to be a sorry business. For this reason, Talleyrand in vain tried to stop the deposition of the Bourbons. Meanwhile, Napoleon announced to Spaniards he had graciously decided to regenerate their country. The Spanish graciously replied by rising against French troops in Madrid on the 2nd of May. This was followed by general insurrection across the country and running battles between French and Spanish armies. Though order was restored in Madrid, on the 19th of July a French army under General Dupont capitulated at Bailen. It was the first major defeat inflicted on French arms since Napoleon became emperor. The Spanish War of Independence had begun with an urban mob, but struck deep roots in the wider populace that overwhelmed the elite of afrancedos that were ready to collaborate with the French. The unique form of guerrilla warfare that emerged from this, motivated by an eclectic mix of social, religious, monarchic, and nationalistic factors, were never successfully dealt with by the French, who would lose on average 100 soldiers every day to guerrilla attacks. Napoleon did not do anything different from usual in Spain. As always, he governed through selective terror, forced conquered territories to pay for their own occupation as well as his other commitments. The difference this time was, as Joseph put it, immense resources will be needed to reduce Spain. This country and this people resemble no other. However, the Spanish rising as of yet did not seem overly serious. After the disaster at Bailen, which sent a panicked Joseph fleeing from Madrid and the French back to the Ebro, Napoleon returned with a devastating campaign that secured much of the country's north and centre. Indeed, it was not at all certain the Spanish, or the also important but often overlooked Portuguese insurrections, would survive these defeats. Nor did the Spanish rising immediately impact the wider war. Britain was of course electrified by events, and Canning responded with his celebrated declaration, "We shall proceed upon the principle that any nation of Europe that starts up with a determination to oppose a power which is the common enemy of all nations and Great Britain, becomes instantly our essential ally." But subsequent results were disappointing. A small force under Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal and defeated Junot at Vimiero, but the French army was then repatriated with all of its loot via the Convention of Sintra, courtesy of Wellesley's incompetent superiors. Canning furiously scribbled that the Portuguese, instead of hailing us as deliverers, must consider us as having interfered only to sanction and secure French robbery. It did, however, mean that Portugal was cleared. This secured the most important of British aims, which was to hold Lisbon, a port that in French hands could be used to intercept the trade on which British survival depended. Sintra was followed up with a brief advance into Spain under Sir John Moore, that was then very nearly trapped by Napoleon and chased to Corunna, where it was evacuated. Canning's hopes that there would be further revolts in Europe proved illusory, and Castlereagh's plans for wider operations in Spain were scrapped after the escape of Moore's army. Wellesley returned in 1809 and resumed an advance into Spain, which met with more success at the Battle of Talavera, but even he was forced to once more retreat under threat from superior French numbers. Relations between allies on the peninsula were also tense. Although Portugal generally proved a steady ally for Whitehall and allowed its troops to serve under British command, relations with Spain, a long-time rival, were tense. Spaniards were deeply suspicious of British designs on their empire and thought London was failing to offer enough assistance. The British tended to think the Spanish incompetent, uncooperative, and bridled at their constant refusal to discuss the opening of America to British trade. By the end of 1809, the British had grave doubts about whether Spain could survive, and if the army in Portugal was worth the cost. In the wider continent, those under Napoleon's influence recognised Joseph's regime. If Alexander was given more freedom by the war, it did not tempt him to abandon Napoleon. Prussians generally agreed the rising would not bring Napoleon down. Only in Austria did the events in Iberia sway policy. In the short term at least, the Spanish Ulcer did not greatly change the European dynamic. Only over the coming years would the catastrophe befalling French armies there become clear. In the meantime, however, Napoleon's distractions in Spain meant the Austrians looked for one final time to solve their security dilemma by military means. The new Austrian Empire, formed from the previously composite Habsburg domains in 1804, found itself in a difficult position after Tilsit. Defeated 18 months earlier at Austerlitz, she avoided the castration applied to Prussia, but had lost its influence in Germany, Italy, and many of the Habsburgs' ancestral lands. The Holy Roman Empire was dissolved, and Francis left at best a second-class emperor, with his newly formed Austrian crown. Sandwiched between France and Russia, Vienna, like all continental powers, attempted to convince Napoleon it could be a useful ally. The key policymakers in this period were the Foreign Minister Stadion, the Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Charles, and Metternich, the coming man at the Hofburg. All of these answered to Emperor Francis. All had their differences, but generally agreed that the Austrian Empire had to adjust itself to French hegemony for the time being, and avoid being broken between the hammer and anvil of Paris and Petersburg. Stadion initially hoped some kind of rapprochement was possible. During the Fourth Coalition, when French armies were bogged down in Poland, Napoleon's diplomatic correspondence had been overly friendly. But with Tilsit settled in the summer of 1807, he denounced Vienna's behaviour in the war as treacherous, and instead resorted to his tried and tested tactic of bullying, forcing the Austrians to break with Britain, offer him new concessions in German affairs, and support in Portugal. Austria's position was bleak, but not disastrous, and it certainly was not catastrophic enough to consider another round of hostilities, or even do much to prepare for it. What changed Vienna's calculation was Spain. Not so much the anti-French rising and defeat, but the attacks on an ancient dynasty at Bayonne. Stadion convinced a horrified Francis that the rising of Aranjuez was caused by French intervention and the Spanish government's failure to resist it. The final overthrow of the Bourbons further spurred a terrified Francis into action, and convinced even doves like Charles that war with France would once again be necessary. If not, they calculated Napoleon could at any moment dethrone the Habsburgs. In the short term, Austrian policy did not change overtly, and Vienna continued its appeasement of France, but everyone now agreed that lying low was no longer a possibility. Military reforms were implemented, including the establishment of a national militia, a system of limited conscription. Alerted by his espionage system of Austria's reorganisation of the army, Napoleon launched a campaign to batter Austria into disarmament. No inducements accompanied his barrage of threats, but plenty of hints that the Habsburgs would this time be facing the armies of Russia and Germany, as well as France. As always, Napoleon proved a far better coalition builder than his opponents. The Emperor had long expected another war with Austria, that he believed would settle his problems with the state once and for all, but in 1809 he was not yet ready for it. The main issue was not the Spanish threat, which he still seems not to have taken particularly seriously at this point, nor was it either the British threat or straining Russian alliance. Napoleon's main concern was really personal. Nearing 40 and still without an heir, any campaign and risk to his personage naturally meant uncertainty and potential instability in France due to the questions over the succession. In the days leading up to the war, Napoleon got whiff of a plot between Talleyrand and Fouché to replace him with Murat on the French throne. It was Austria, however, that vacillated over the war. Having armed out of fear Napoleon might suddenly launch a Spanish-style coup, in August 1808 Metternich advised that the danger had passed after multiple stormy interviews with Napoleon. Instead, he suggested Austria now recognise Joseph as King of Spain, and Murat as King of Naples. This could win Austria goodwill and allow it to participate in the Congress of Erfurt. Besides, Metternich decided that it would be madness on our part to provoke a war with France. Stadion ignored this advice. After some further hesitations, by October 1808 he and Charles had once again resigned themselves to war, with Francis finally being convinced in December. War, it was believed, was inevitable, and Austria only stood to lose by waiting. The time to strike would be in 1809, whilst Napoleon was still bogged down in Spain. The finance minister, O'Donnell, argued Austrian armaments could not be sustained fiscally past March. Of the leading ministers, only Metternich still voiced reservations, believing an alliance of all the European powers was needed to defeat the French. Nonetheless, the Hofburg convinced itself it was now or never. Stadion hoped that Russia would remain neutral, Prussia would join the coalition, and Germany would rise in revolt. All of these expectations proved to be unfounded, but served to delude the Habsburgs that they had some chance of success. Feelers were put out to Russia, including an offer to recognise a Russian annexation of the Danubian principalities. Alexander responded by pocketing the concession, then turning around and announcing that if Austria started a war, he would be forced to side with France. War was not in Russia's interest, for it would likely extend Napoleon's reach further into the Habsburg Empire, but she was certainly not going to throw the entente with France away for yet another doomed Austrian campaign. The natural partner was obviously Britain. The reality was one of the most farcical attempts at alliance in the whole Napoleonic Wars. Austria only began appealing for British financial aid in late 1808, as it was on the verge of launching the conflict, and demanded such a large sum she basically stunned London into silence. Both powers also failed utterly to coordinate strategy or war aims. Having earlier encouraged Austria to rise, Whitehall now told the Austrians they were on their own. No regular subsidy was ever forthcoming. Indeed, for all Napoleon's carping on about English money when he was in one of his more melodramatic moods, only later did British financial subsidies become consistent and a major factor in the coalitions. Whilst Canning at this point was more interested in trying to oust his rival Castlereagh from office than Austria's plight. The lesson the Habsburgs learned in 1809 was not that she needed a European coalition to defeat France, it was that Britain and Russia were unable to help her. It meant that alliance with Napoleon, however humiliating, would from then on be Austria's key to survival. More than that, like a scorned ex taking another lover, it was the only way to prove to London and Petersburg how vital Vienna really was. Austrian hopes for victory were largely pinned on enlisting German support and minimising the Confederation's participation in the conflict. It hoped that Prussia would also join the struggle, for which Berlin would be restored to its 1806 borders, whilst Austria would return to those of 1805. In Italy, she wished to retake Venetia and overthrow the Napoleonic order in the peninsula. Vienna made no claim to restore the Holy Roman Empire, and instead tried to win German states to her side with promises of territorial compensation, possibly at France's expense. Yet the Habsburgs also made clear their quarrel was with Napoleon alone, not the French nation, contradictory in some ways with their hints at conquests on the left bank of the Rhine. The call for popular uprisings in Germany made Emperor Francis nervous and drove those rulers tempted to abandon Napoleon back to him. She spoke of partnership with Prussia, but equally hoped to replace French domination of Germany with Austrian. These contradictions were not Machiavellian scheming, rather they show that the Habsburgs lacked any real idea about what they actually wanted from the war. Military victory must come first, negotiations second. Their main offensive was to be in South Germany, with the ultimate ambition of driving the French back to the Rhine. What the Austrians would do if this actually succeeded, they themselves did not know. This, of course, was more than Austria could hope for once the war began. The only major rising was in the Tyrol, which was somewhat ironically more dangerous to German Bavaria than it was to the French. Prussia, after hesitation, refused to enter the war. Even hawks in Berlin wished Austria to first draw the French onto themselves and win the major victories before Prussia rose. Russia, whilst not exactly pursuing the war vigorously, still took an active part, rather than the passivity hoped for by Vienna. In this sense, the war was almost a foregone conclusion. A brief Austrian advance into Bavaria and Italy was followed by a string of French victories that left Napoleon in Vienna once more by May. The most famous event of the war took place at Aspern, when an overconfident French emperor pushed across the Danube and was badly beaten by Archduke Charles, probably being lucky to escape with most of his army intact. Not to be outdone, the Habsburgs paraded once more their fabled ability to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, and were decisively beaten at Wagram just over a month later, with an armistice following soon after. The only real British supporting effort, an amphibious assault in the Low Countries, came too late to seriously help the Habsburgs, and was besides a dismal failure that saw a large part of the army invalided home. There are of course counterfactuals in the war. Had Prussia decided to act, had Alexander chosen to remain more passive, had the British Walcheren campaign been better handled, debating these is useless. The fact was the Austrians were outdone by Napoleon in diplomatic and military preparations before the war. The aftermath would require a hard adjustment. On the 14th of October 1809, the Treaty of Schönbrunn was signed. Austria was to lose 3 million inhabitants, access to the sea, vast swathes of land, pay an 85 million franc indemnity, and restrict her army to just 150,000 men. This peace was harsh, but less so than Napoleon had planned during the war, when he had sketched out proposals for an independent kingdom of Bohemia, and called on the Hungarians to rise. But the Habsburgs' power base at this point was Hungary, which remained loyal, whilst Alexander was unwilling to see yet another French vassal state centred on Prague. The result was that Napoleon settled for a punitive peace, reducing Austria to the second rank of powers that could never challenge him again. Perhaps more than any other treaty, Schönbrunn shows Napoleon's lack of an overall goal. Austria was to serve no purpose in his system, except remaining weak and staying out of his way. Despite the near disaster at Aspern, the Fifth Coalition showed few signs of the Napoleonic Empire's coming decline, but it helped set the stage. The tensions in the Franco-Russian relationship were exacerbated. Napoleon believed the Russians had been lethargic in their pursuit of the war. Alexander pointed out that he had assisted France against Austria more than they had helped against Sweden, and was annoyed that the Grand Duchy of Warsaw had been enlarged, clearly growing a potential Polish state. Nor did the conflict reset the British position back to that of 1807. The war effort had been greatly improved under Castlereagh's stewardship, though he was tragically now out of office, for reasons that will be discussed next time. Britain continued to hold Sicily, and whilst Wellesley, now Viscount Wellington, was pinned back in Portugal by a large French army, he maintained the formidable line of Torres Vedras, which protected Lisbon and thus British trade. Hence, Britain continued to win the less spectacular, but arguably more important, naval war. On the continent, Aspern and Wagram showed that whilst Napoleon remained formidable, the Grand Army of Austerlitz and the incompetent opponents it faced were no more, and in Iberia, the struggle was only just beginning. Between 1807 and 1809, the Tilsit system, established by Napoleon and Alexander, comprehensively failed. It was ironically, however, Austria's defeat that exposed this, as Britain and Russia were left to face the full force of Napoleonic imperialism alone.